All right, so here we go. We're going to talk to you about an entirely new era. As you will see in a minute, Silicon Valley is always kind of trying to understand what's next. What's the next big thing? What are the next significant developments? So Lisa, take it away.
So as an introduction to us, so we are part of EDG, which stands for Enterprise Development Group. Herman and I are co-founders of that many years back, over 30 years back that we've been in Silicon Valley. And we specialize in three things, which is really first looking business strategy, but which is looking into the future, really seeing where's the world going, whether you go there or not, that the world's on the move, it is headed somewhere. And can you see what are those trends and what are the big disruptions that are on the way and what are the opportunities that are emerging, and then setting the strategy for that. And then also looking at what are the innovation best practices that help your people, whether it's 3 people or 3,000 or 30,000 people. How do you help your people to create into that future together? And what does it require from leaders? And we sometimes think of that as future-driven leadership. So we play kind of up and down that keyboard, and depending on what groups that we work with need, we fill in the other parts of that.
Oops. There we go. And now I have to find. There we go.
We work with companies all over the world, a lot in the US, many that are international, and they tend to be the leaders in their industry, names you often would recognize in that industry, but they're leaders in the industry in the current generation of that industry, looking ahead to say, well, what's the emerging generation, and to ensure that they're going to be leaders in that era that's on its way. We write a lot about what we do as we go along. So we'll be talking about things that are ideas that are in all of this writing that we do. So there we are. There's kind of a picture of Silicon Valley, and we're sort of we're just down the road from Stanford when we're there. Our office is down the road from Stanford. And so this is just a quick picture of when Michelle asks what we're going to be talking about, is that we're very much into what are those transformations that are ahead. So Silicon Valley has been moving from industrial to digital and social and mobile and global, and more recently into hyper digital, like smart everything, smart and connected everything. Any industry you can think of is starting to get smart and connected with sensors that are giving off big data. But then predictive analytics, the data tells you what's happening now, but also tells you and what's coming next. And then there's AI and machine learning to help think about how to react to that. So sometimes even without humans, when the data tells you what's coming next, already systems can react to that. And you put in robotics and 3D printing and natural language where we can just talk to everything in the way we would speak to humans. And so it's quite an amazing time, that hyper digital curve. And it's really hitting any industry, you know, from manufacturing and everything that moves, and cities and education. So anything you can think of, retail, healthcare, it's all moving into that hyper digital world. And that's what's been going on in Silicon Valley maybe for the last 10 or 15 years, is going from that first generation digital to this hyper digital.
So it's basically one of the things that comes with that is this sort of pioneering spirit of Silicon Valley, always looking for the next thing, and to sometimes look for disruptions and surprises that nobody imagined. So with that in mind.
So what's happening is, while we're in the middle of that, like in California, we'd say, we're on a roll. You know, there's so much happening everywhere. It's such an exciting time. And we're hitting a wall. There's something new. It's like as if the natural world is saying, hey, remember me? I'm here. You're not just in this tech playground. You happen to be innovating on this biological living system that supports you to do everything you're doing. You are not a robot. You don't just need electricity. And so we're hitting the wall. And what we're going to talk about is that's what seems to be new in Silicon Valley now, is the recognition. It's been there, the data has been there our entire adult lives, the entire hyper digital era. Everybody's known in the background this is there, and it's finally becoming urgent.
So while Silicon Valley has been focused on transformation driven by technology, it looks like we're shifting very quickly into the notion of transformation by natural forces. And that's what we're going to be talking about, as Lisa just said. So this was just last week. So these are headlines from last week that talk about Earth is going to reach the temperature tipping point in the next 10 to 20 to 30 years. We already knew that, but what that study is about is that as we're heading towards that tipping point, the plants that we're counting on to draw down CO2 are actually increasingly no longer capable of taking in the CO2 and sequestering it in the ground. That's a huge development, right? When humans run a high fever, at some point the body shuts down. And what we're discovering is that that's the same with plants. So the very thing we're counting on to help us out here is at risk of just no longer being able to effectively respirate.
So we can't plant enough forests to get ourselves out of trouble.
Because if they can no longer draw down the CO2. So, these are shocking kind of inputs. The other is Southern Ocean waters are warming faster than thought. Again, another thing that has impacts for thousands of miles beyond the Southern Oceans, because it changes the flow of the water, it changes the nature of the winds, it changes, the nature of climate in that way. And then the final one is one out of the World Economic Forum from Davos, which was written by the chief risk officer by Zurich Insurance, and says climate change will be sudden and cataclysmic. We need to act fast. Another extraordinary article that talks about how the accumulation of these different effects, right, what I just talked about from the plants to the Southern Oceans, at some point, one last piece comes out and the whole thing starts to collapse in a cataclysmic way. And what we want to do is sort of move you in the sort of Silicon Valley spirit into that kind of consciousness, into that kind of thinking, and look at how did we get here? And what we're going to do is take a very deep look in how we got here. We're going to take about 10 minutes or so to take you very far back, and then talk a little bit about where are we now, and then finally look more into what is happening in Silicon Valley and beyond in terms of where we're heading and what can we do. So this is going to be something of a wake-up call.
Okay, so we're going to look at the deep evolutionary history, a very quick overview of where do we come from. And this is material that comes from a science exhibit that's called A Walk Through Time. It was created by Sid Liebes, who had been at Stanford University and started the human biology program there, and then moved on to HP and HP Labs, which is kind of like their elite, more future thinking part of HP, Hewlett-Packard. And this is a walk he had collected from the beginning of Earth Day, all the information about the evolution of life on Earth from the time of when life first began on the planet. And he put all of this information in panels about, later it gets to be about every 100 steps, but it's a foot that you walk is 1,000,000 years. And you really walk it so that in a physical way, you feel the evolution of life on Earth. And there's a few important points that come out of that walk that are worth showing. This was first shown at Stanford. Oh, so it's also, so that each, let's see, so it's about, we're going to walk through 4,700 million years, and it's going to be 1,432 meters.
If you walk it.
If you would walk it.
With each foot being a
yeah, and we're going to show you some of the highlights because it's where we come from today.
So this is already 1 billion years into the existence of the planet, and about 500 million years after the beginning of life. And we now have these microorganisms that start fermenting CO2 into food and creating their bodies. So by 500 million years into their existence, these microorganisms started getting quite effective at basically converting CO2.
And they're going to come back into our story later because these fermenters happen to still be around. So 3.7 billion years later. What's also interesting to know is that our atmosphere on Earth is very different from any other planet in the solar system. The others are mostly carbon dioxide. And in our planet, life took the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and created oxygen. So we're about 21% oxygen, but that didn't just happen to be there through physical forces. That's there because life created it. Life created this atmosphere that we live within. And so after another 1 billion years of life creating it, this is halfway through the time between where life began, the first living DNA on the planet, and where we are now. So 2 billion years into our story, life was drowning in its own waste. It produced oxygen. And in fact, oxygen was toxic to these first bacteria, anaerobic, which means they don't breathe oxygen. And that's what all of life was. And 90% of life died on the planet. And so when 10% only made it through, and some hid from oxygen, they went into swamps, they went, into
later
the mud.
into our guts, right?
Yeah,
I
they
mean,
went
we're still having those, right?
Yeah, they went inside other organisms. They
Right.
are still inside us. We need them to survive. They don't have our DNA. They still have DNA dating back to those times. But a very small percent of those did something that had never been done before. They were our early innovators and saved us. They learned to breathe oxygen, and it gave them this boost in energy from breathing oxygen rather than the hydrogen sulfide they were breathing before and CO2. They got a burst in energy and could get many more molecules of ATP, their energy source, and suddenly they could move for the first time so that they didn't just drift along the currents and go wherever the water went. So this innovation not only saved them from extinction, and potentially all life on the planet could have just ended then, but it also gave them abilities they had never had before.
So then another billion years in, just a few years, right? We finally have something that is recognizable to the human eye, and bodies start to be developed out of mineralized tissues, and it starts looking more familiar. So that's the Cambrian Explosion.
And life was still in the water at that point. So this was just about 400 million years ago, almost, is the first time that life came into the water. So if you think about it,
out of the water,
our DNA evolved through all these stages, right? The DNA inside you came from that very first DNA and kind of went parent, child, parent, child, parent, child for billions of years. So we were part of that. So sometimes we say, when we came out of the water, so you have to realize that up until out of those billions of years of life, it's only in the last 400 million years that we came out of the water onto land, and then what an amazing time it was.
So it was also a time then where plants were abundant, CO2 was rich, and a lot of these plants, as the earth at that point still was moving quite a bit, were folded underground. That was basically the creation of our oil and gas. It took 90 million years to create what we have been taking out of the ground in the last 200 years, right? So just think about the proportions of 90 million years of putting all that hydrocarbon underground and then releasing.
What's also interesting about that too is it shows you when life came into a whole new territory. Imagine that if life has always been in the water and then comes to this uncharted land, empty land, all its territory, and then how it just filled it with all kinds of diversity.
So all kinds of life starts happening. We know about that. Dinosaurs show up and they're around for over 165 million years, and then this asteroid hits the planet, and that's the end of the dinosaurs. But there were small mammals that were nocturnal, they were underground in part, and they kind of came to life. So whenever something cataclysmic happens, life, as long as it's preserved, will find a way to kind of find new niches.
But it does show that just because you've been here, and we haven't been here 165 million years, but just because you've been here a long time, there's no guarantee on this planet that you get to stay.
In fact, I mean, we're talking about the last, 5 million years here, and we just showed up. This version of this humanoid started showing up about 300,000 years ago. Even 300,000 years ago, they were still Cro-Magnon. They were still, other versions of a humanoid kind of expression. And if you would look at having just walked 1.5 kilometers, this would be sort of the front end of our toenail is where humans showed up, right? So the reason why we wanted to start there is because we're looking at a very big problem, and we want to create a context for what does it actually mean about where we are today, and also where are the solutions. So this was just a background to show you that life is what transforms the earth. And after each extinction, it takes tens of millions of years for life to return to the previous level of biodiversity. This is a really interesting call, right? If humanity doesn't do anything about what we have caused in the last few hundred years, if we don't actively engage, Earth doesn't mind. Earth will take tens of millions of years to recover. But the question that comes before us is, do we want to be a partner with these natural forces in a way where we can be an evolutionary force for the good, right? For good, not just the evolutionary force that has dragged all that carbon out of the ground, put it into the atmosphere. But now that we begin to understand what's going on, we can engage differently.
And we're the only species that knows this story about all the life on the planet, and the only ones that can manage to do something about it. And we're the first generation of our species to know. When my parents were born, none of this information was known, and there was actually thought that there was maybe one galaxy in the universe. So we have very different information now.
So now we're going to look at where are we now, right? So this is going to be sort of the dark part of this conversation, because we're going to look at what is it actually we're facing today. And we're going to look a little bit at data that comes from the Climate Reality Project that's associated with Al Gore. And so, talk for a minute about
So a couple of two key concepts we just think help make the story make sense, which is our radiation comes from the sun, it hits the earth, it bounces back up. There's this atmosphere that life created for us is like an envelope, and it's like called greenhouse effect, because in the greenhouse it bounces. You see those arrows where it bounces back in, and the heat stays in that envelope of our atmosphere. And that as CO2 increases, you see that blue line that's the outside of the envelope, that increases, and more of the radiation is trapped. So even if we don't do anything, you'll see later that because we have that envelope, that heat from the sun is still coming. No matter what we do, the heat comes every day. And if we keep that envelope around us, the earth will keep heating up.
So that, what we're doing is we are heating that up, and we are putting in about 152 million tons of man-made global pollution every 24 hours. And that's the equivalent to 500,000 Hiroshimas a day. 500,000 first-generation atomic bombs is the energy that we're actually putting into this atmosphere. So imagine that 5 times a second, this is what's happening. And so that derives, of course, from our way of life, from our way of production.
And this just really shows that everything, our whole economy, every part of the world we've come to depend on is taking up that oil and gas and from that Carboniferous era, and we're taking it, using it, and putting it up into the air. So our manufacturing, anything that moves, our agriculture, just everything that our lives now depend on, the infrastructure of our economy is all taking things from underground, using it, and putting it into the air.
So here's the dilemma, is that fundamentally we emit all these kind of things in all these kind of different industries into the atmosphere. Some of it gets drawn back down by nature, right? Land sinks and coastal ocean sinks, but about 60% remains in the atmosphere. So we're overproducing CO2 beyond what nature can absorb, right? This is a massive problem. This comes from Project Drawdown, a fantastic project, which I encourage all of you to really get involved with and understand. And what that has created is that while Homo sapiens, remember that 300,000 years, in that period of time, the atmosphere on this planet has been between 170 and 280 or so parts per million. We are now at over 400 parts per million. That story that Lise and I just described so far has added this kind of significant amount of CO2. This is something that goes back millions of years since last time we had this kind of atmosphere.
And no human has been alive at that level of CO2.
No creature, no current creature, right? No species of the moment has been around in this kind of atmosphere. And not only is it that we have created this overabundance of CO2 that sits up there, CO2 is a persistent molecule. And so by now we have about 1,000 gigatons of CO2 up there that produce that 417 parts per million. And that even if we stop putting anything else out there in terms of CO2, that legacy load is persistent. That sits there and causes the kind of reality that we are set for now at this 400 plus parts per million reality. Now we are seeing some effects.
So this is what it looked like in Silicon Valley back in September. And in fact, the sky wasn't this red. It was really just this red for one day, but it was like this for 29 days. And it came from fires. We were surrounded on all sides by massive, just scary fires.
And they're smoky. It was hard to breathe.
Yeah. The air quality, this comes from purple air, which is air quality. And so where it's red and dark red it's not really safe to be outside.
From Mexico to Canada.
Yeah. And so if we hadn't been wearing masks, we would have needed to wear them. But it was if you go back to that, it was the whole coast of North America. But then temperatures went along with it in drought as well. So in Los Angeles, it hit 49.5 degrees Celsius. So in one of the major cities in the US, and that's just pretty stunning.
Now, so these are the effects on climate on Earth, on land, right? But one of the really big problems that is rarely talked about is that the oceans absorb about 1/3 of that CO2 that we're adding to the atmosphere, right? So that's a massive amount of added CO2 that the oceans have to absorb. And what happens is that it converts into carbonic acid, right? And so what's happening is that the oceans are acidifying. And if we keep going at the rates that they're currently acidifying, by the end of the century, they will be 170% more acidic than they are today. 170% more acidic than they are today. And that's too acidic for 97% of ocean life. So,
So we want to just pause for a moment and take a breath, because I don't think we often hear when we're in business or innovation presentations to hear that you and us personally are killing 97% of the life in the ocean. This is not what we're often hearing. We didn't intend to do that. We are trying to make life better. We are trying to build cities. We're trying to build the society. We didn't really set out to innovate in order to wipe out Earth and all the ocean, to wipe out life in all of the oceans.
So speaking about life in the oceans, this is an incredibly important one, which is that actually every second breath you take comes from the ocean, right? Phytoplankton is a microscopic marine plant that produces about 50 or more % of the world's oxygen. And what's happening is that, again, because of warming, phytoplankton is under duress. It's in great danger, and there's a possibility that by the end of the century, again, there will no longer be any phytoplankton.
And part of the reason for that is that it's also warmer. So the water's getting warmer, but it is also because it's getting acidic, and it also has less oxygen, can hold less oxygen in the water. So it's another reason to take a breath, is because it's our breath that is coming. We're not just affecting life in the ocean, but in fact, we're affecting our own ability to breathe as well.
So just to close this part of the story about what it is we're facing, to kind of give it a sense of reality, this is what the world looks like today. You can see Florida. Let's take a look back 300 million years, when it was the last time that CO2 levels were at 400 parts per million. And look at that. Where's Florida, right? Something happened. At that time, when the CO2 levels were above 400 parts per million, the oceans, the temperatures were 3 to 4 degrees warmer than they are today, which is the trajectory we're on. If with no change, we're going to hit that by the end of this century. Again, there was no ice in the Northern Hemisphere. Again, we're heading in that direction. Sea levels were 18 meters higher than they are today, and 130 kilometers further inland, right? So that's basically, if we do not deal with that 1,000 gigatons of baked in reality, right? That legacy load, this is basically the world that we already live in, right? It's just that there's a lag between what the reality is of the atmospheric reality and what it looks like on the ground. And so that's what we're facing. That's what Silicon Valley is starting to kick in, or the world is starting to kick in, to start to say, hey, what are we going to do?
So a quote that we really like by the author Carter Bays says, "Stop thinking about this summer as the warmest one in the last 125 years, because that's what we always see in the papers, and we see the charts that go up, and they go up to our year. But think about where it keeps going. This is the coolest one that we'll have in the next 125 years."
So we wanted to sort of make the point that this is an interconnected ecosystem. That's why we talked about the oceans. We live on land mostly, and that's what we are sensing. We have a sense of the atmosphere, but it's an interconnected ecosystem. We put the carbon up there, and this is really a critical reality that we have to do something to bring it back down. We cannot just stop putting out carbon. There's a lot of carbon out there already. We need to start to think about technologies, approaches to draw that back down.
So it's carbon neutral and carbon negative that we need. So we're the first generation to know about this, really, but we're also, from everything scientists are telling us, that we're the last generation to be able to do something about it.
All right, and now with this, we want to step into where are we going? What are the opportunities that, of what we can do for this very dramatic, radical reality? And again, it sets the tone for what's going on in Silicon Valley. When you see reality like that, when you see disruption like that, you go to work. you have to do something, right? And so, you know, with the point we made earlier, we already shared with you, there are these headlines. This is an interesting one that said the Arctic is in a death spiral, right? Wake up, it's in a death spiral. How much longer will it exist? The region is unraveling faster than anyone could have once predicted. That's the Arctic. And then very often there's the byline to all these horrible stories that says, but there may still be time to act, right? It may still be okay. It's kind of like, don't get too scared. There may still be time to act. But increasingly, that there may still be time to act is being replaced. We must take immediate action to reduce warming, right? When the chief risk officer of Zurich Insurance says, it's going to be cataclysmic, it's going to be sudden, that changes the mindset. It's not just there may be time, this is the time, right? We need to step in now. It's time to act in this moment. And that's what we want to address now, where we're seeing this sort of shifting understanding that we're really moving into a new era. We're moving into what we call the regenerative era, where we need to do all kinds of things to actively engage with this problem, whether be it biological or technological or other solutions or policy solutions, right? So the UN General says we need to declare climate emergencies, right? Yesterday we heard the new majority leader from the Senate talk about we must declare a climate emergency in the United States. That's the first time we heard a politician quite say it so bluntly, a politician in charge. Same with China. The United States finally came back to the climate, to the Paris Climate Agreement. So companies are stepping in. Mark Carney, who is the head of the Bank of England, says, if you ignore the climate crisis as a company, you're going to go bankrupt, right? This is fundamental to the existence, it's an existential reality. That's why the World Economic Forum is getting involved. 130 banks are getting enrolled. It's becoming the main topic for a lot of fundamental discussion about where are we going.
Well, and those are kind of also a list of a lot of investors, and so which is so much part of the ecosystem of Silicon Valley as well. This is one of the articles that I liked in an interesting kind of way, which was from Morgan Stanley report that said stopping global warming will cost $50 trillion. Which is, most people are paying attention to that as the cost, but Silicon Valley mindset, and, really for innovators anywhere around the globe, you're going, $50 trillion, if somebody's paying that, somebody's getting it. Who's getting that? So innovators see funding for whole new generations of technology.
So here it is, renewables, electric vehicles, carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, biofuels, that's where the money's going to go.
$50 trillion economy. So when we hit the wall in this digital and hyper digital economy, it's because a whole new era is emerging. And what we're seeing in Silicon Valley and in many places around the world is that we're seeing those early days of the regenerative era. And it hits every industry, right? So no matter what you're in, agriculture, transportation, energy, retail, logistics, travel, and everything.
So it's a time for moonshots. Why we like the word moonshot is because a moonshot is something that a human being in some position of authority declares, or human beings declare, we need to get to the moon, right? By X time, we're going to go there, not knowing exactly what the solutions will be, but that declaration starts mobilizing action. Again, I talked to you a little bit about Project Drawdown. Again, I suggest you check it out. It's really interesting because it defines 100 specific solutions and what the impact can be on our CO2 budget, right? What can we do if we go into electricity, into industry? What are the opportunities there in buildings, in transportation, in agriculture? So it's really good to have some kind of orientation that says these are the kind of areas where we can really have an impact to start drawing down that CO2 that we absolutely must do. Over 240 global companies have made a commitment to go 100% renewable. And from everything we have shared with you, that's not enough, right? Renewable is not enough. It's a good start. And it's really fantastic that all these companies are starting to wake up. They're starting to say, wait a minute, we need to move into something that's distinct from the way we go about our business now. A really exciting, interesting development comes out of Walmart, where the CEO of Walmart said that working with our supply chains, customers, NGOs, and others, we hope to play a part in transforming the world's supply chains to be more regenerative, right? A big company like Walmart that is so dependent on supply chains can make a position like that and changes everything, right? When Walmart goes there, really interesting things happen. The world must reduce, avoid, and remove greenhouse gas emissions. No longer is it enough to slow down climate change and protect what we have left, right? That's no longer enough. As a society, we are at an inflection point, right? As a society, we are at an inflection point. That's what the World Economic Forum talks about. That's what Walmart's talking about. If we do not act now, we may not have an opportunity to do something later. These are incredibly important statements by these leaders, right?
And for us in the US, it's really interesting to talk about business leaders who we are used to thinking about with economic pressures, talking about an inflection point in society. So it's quite moving. Google's also doing amazing things. So they're looking at, they've offset their entire carbon legacy, but they've committed to being carbon-free operations by 2030, but not just by doing offsets, not by saying, well, we're going to be carbon positive, we're going to be putting more carbon into the atmosphere, but we're going to offset it by taking it out somewhere else. They're saying, no, they're not even going to put any up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every single day of the year. They're going to be carbon-free in their operations. And that's a very dramatic declaration.
It's a huge, huge challenge. It's very hard to do. And what they're also talking about is they're going to create a whole new industry or industries through this commitment, right? So that's an intention as well. They're helping to create the regenerative economy by creating entirely new industries that are going to help them succeed with that idea.
And Microsoft has also been quite inspiring. So Microsoft with the president, CFO, CEO, right, top leadership taking a stand for this, that they'll be carbon negative by 2030. They'll remove all the historical emissions of carbon by 2050, which means anything Microsoft has put into the air from the founding in 1975, they are going to pull that back down so that if there's more carbon in the atmosphere by 2050, it did not come from Microsoft. But they're doing a $1 billion climate innovation fund because nobody really knows how to be that carbon negative and how to do that much carbon removal. And so it's time for innovators to get busy and find the methods by which this can be done.
One way that they're funding this $1 billion climate fund is that they have an internal
carbon tax.
Right?
And so with the carbon tax, they're taking so they're really having to measure, all the departments measuring their carbon footprint and paying a tax on the carbon that they're putting up. And that also goes into part of that innovation fund.
It's an internal tax that they impose on their own employees.
Later, they're going to put that on their suppliers as well. So similar to Walmart, it's going to start impacting the whole supply chain. They're coming up within a lot of business. If that's the overall strategic business objective, they're coming up with many products and services to have a business model around this, right? So it's not just going to be something negative. In fact, they're planning to make a lot of money from this. So if the very first one is that they're going out to their customers, and as their customers also start measuring their own carbon footprints, if they shift from their own data center on-site operations to using Microsoft Cloud, it will cut their own carbon footprint by 98%. So the more they get their customers to care about it, the more likely they are going to be to choose Microsoft Cloud. And then I thought the fourth one over can be quite interesting about what's your carbon footprint. So they need to have companies have easy ways to be able to do that so they'll know to choose Microsoft. So they also have a tool that is one of their products and services where people can look at their own carbon footprint. And SAP is one of the largest kind of data companies where many companies will be able to do this as well, is also coming up with carbon emissions accounting system.
The CEO of SAP just pointed out to his employees that we are in 85% of the most polluting companies in the world, and managing their supply chain, kind of tracking back to what the head of Walmart said. The supply chain is a really critical aspect of starting to fix this problem, understanding it, and SAP is very well positioned.
Well, SAP has their data, and so the data is everything we've been doing in that digital and hyper digital era where we've gotten so good at data. Now we can start using that data to help build the regenerative era as well.
So let's move from that into now, how do we create into this new regenerative era? What kind of ecosystems are going to be created? And because we don't know the solutions, we have to work together. Collaboration is going to be fundamental. So Transform to Net Zero is an initiative by Microsoft that includes companies like Mercedes-Benz, Nike, Danone, Unilever, Maersk, the biggest shipping companies in the world, Starbucks, etc. So companies have started to come together saying, we need to fix this problem. We don't know how. Let's join together. Google similarly is working again with Project Drawdown on something called Drawdown Labs. And that's again a consortium of companies that includes even companies like IDEO and others, Impossible, Allbirds, and Google is one of the big drivers of that initiative. So again, we see all these networks. We see interesting startups, that are part of this emerging ecosystem where companies come together to create solutions together.
This one was Free Electrons, and it was started by 10 different utilities and energy companies around the world and some groups that were in Silicon Valley. And so putting together a startup incubator where they look at startups in Silicon Valley, these 10 utilities, they choose the ones they want to have incubated. They may invest in them over time, but specifically looking for the startups related to help them.
So speaking of startups, there are, how many? 13
13 energy, they didn't all fit on this page. 13 energy incubators and accelerators around just in Silicon Valley. You probably have many more where you are, only focused on energy startups.
There are interesting things like air miners. It's a consortium of many companies that focused on mining the air, right? We have learned in the last 200 years to mine the ground, right? To bring stuff out of the ground. How about, because we have all the CO2 in the air, we mine the air?
And Air Miners actually they concentrate on 3 different kinds of companies. So, and it's a platform, it's a collection, and they have education, and you can see those companies. So airminers.org, which is another one of the groups we'd encourage you to look at. Yeah. But they look at who's doing carbon removal. How are they doing it? What are all the different ways of doing that? What sequestration? Once you get the carbon, where can you put it? How long will it stay there? And then also looking at products that we can take. Here's a resource that we don't want in the air, but it's a resource that's input into many different other things. What's carbon? What's CO2? What are the products that we can make out of it? Opus 12 is one of those where they're also looking at how to take that CO2 from smokestacks and turning it into biofuels. And Novo Nutrients is another one of the companies looking at how do we turn it into food by getting that CO2 and using those fermenters. Remember that we said we'd come back to those early fermenters that were one of the first life forms on the planet are still here, using them inside the smokestacks, and they turn CO2 into proteins. The protein gets fed to the fish in fish farms, and it ends up as farmed salmon on our plates.
So this is a fantastic example of the huge and interesting opportunities. Imagine you're a utility, you're producing a lot of CO2, you can convert that into food for fish and solve another problem, which is that in order to feed fish today, we're drawing out small little fish out of the oceans, feed them 5 pounds for every pound of salmon. So it solves yet another very significant problem.
So we're going to go through some of these quickly because we're about the point where we need to stop so we can give you guys some time to discuss with us. But Bill Gross is also another innovator that's been connected in with Silicon Valley. He presented recently at an Air Miners program, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about
amazing
this
stuff.
one in the middle with Energy Vault.
Take a look at him and Idea Lab and these developments. This one is super interesting, and to me as a Swiss, interesting because it's being built near Bellinzona in Ticino, and it's a gravity battery. So imagine you have these massive, all these weights on the ground, and as you overproduce energy, they get lifted up like this massive tower, and you build this building throughout the day of these bricks, of these heavy bricks, and then at night when there's no more energy, no more solar energy, they come back down and basically create energy on the way down. It works very much like pumped hydro, right? Hydro, during the day, we pump up water, and then at night they can bring it down. This is very similar, but the cost differential is extraordinary. So lithium-ion batteries are about 25 cents per watt or kilowatt, and Energy Vault is 3.5%. It's just hard to imagine how much better that is.
We liked it just as the kind of story of just looking at the innovation that's emerging. Let's just take we can do it. It can be built anywhere, that there's solar or wind energy that we want to
Well,
make
it's really
sure
interesting about
use.
this one. It's based on physics, but it also requires AI, right? Without modern technology, it couldn't be done. It would be impossible, right? So that's what's so unique about this moment now, is a lot of the solutions are driven by these new technologies. There's direct air capture. This is very engineering oriented. Mycelium, so now moving into nature. Mycelium is mushrooms, it's fungi. Huge opportunity there. They are extremely good at drawing down CO2 and putting it underground.
They're selling little products. That ball that you saw, it was actually something anybody can get for their garden, and so you can have the whole world helping to capture the carbon and put it into the ground.
If the whole world starts putting mycelium into their yards, interesting things might happen. This is Kiss the Ground is a film that I encourage all of you to see. It makes some very interesting points about just how destructive, modern industrial agriculture is. And you can see it basically creates desert. And then, once we've created desert, we need to do a lot of chemical inputs. A more natural approach to agriculture brings down a lot more CO2. This is again from Drawdown. A lot of different aspects of nature can be put to work. This one is interesting. Just a few days ago, maybe 2 or 3 days ago, Elon Musk announced the $100 million donation for the best carbon capture technology. Again, he gets it, right? He's waking up. I mean, he was always there, but he's starting to see, I need to apply, he's the richest man in the world now. I need to apply some of that wealth to drawing down CO2. That's the main topic. And so the question then is, why not make it beautiful, right? We're humans and culture is very important. Think of the Renaissance, think of moments when humanity changes.
So the pictures we showed before what looked like very engineering tech solutions, but it can be beautiful. We can have solar, we can have wind that looks like art, we can have water, energy, it can be playful and fun and just really capture the spirit of the wind, so that our new energy solutions and our carbon solutions can be beautiful as well.
So speaking of something, now I'm going to take you into, based on Michelle's invitation to talk about Burning Man, we're going to talk about imagine creating a new world. So an aspect of Silicon Valley, as we pointed out, is to always be at the forefront of things, to always think ahead, to always be impacted by what's changing. And one of the things, of course, is social change. It's the development of new culture. And so there's this interesting thing that's related to Silicon Valley, this whole area, but it's a worldwide effort that's called Burning Man. And it is about imagining to create a new world. And people come together and in this desert, right? This is a huge desert in the middle of Nevada.
It's called the playa, which means beach, but in Spanish, but there is no water on this desert. It's a dried lake bed. It used to be a playa, perhaps. But what it shows is that similar to that whole new regenerative era, it shows blank, empty space that you can create into. And this is what gets created for Burning Man. This is 75,000 people who are coming, and then 10 square miles out there of, you can just see empty playa, and that's where the art and all the kind of some big art, big exhibits get built.
So this is a city of 75,000 people that are coming together to build it every year, to build it, and at the end take it back down, and there can be nothing left behind. So within a few months after this event, you can go to that desert and you cannot see anything.
If there's glitter, if there's nails, if there's anything, you cannot come back.
It looks a little bit like a refugee camp at some level. It's, in a way, it is, right? It is an interesting project that brings people together, building these environments where they can come together, talk, have deeply meaningful, interesting conversation that are far beyond anything that
this is our camp, Ideate. This is part of the Moonshot Tea Lounge that people came to have tea and then also to talk about their passion projects, their Moonshot projects.
Think about it as a TED conference in the desert, right? With the remarkable conversations, politicians come, Elon Musk shows up, Hollywood people come up, scientists, and it's a party too, right? But the weather is sometimes very difficult because it's a desert. There can be sandstorms, there's dust storms, but the conversation goes on, and there are remarkable conversations about urban developments, about you name it, it's there. This is then at night, the LEDs come up, interesting physical structures, fantastic art, right? This is two humans that don't get along anymore, but inside there's these young kids that want to play together. Huge sculpture. This one was called "What Would the World Be Like If Women Were Safe?" And funny cars, you know, the creativity is absolutely remarkable. Amazing environments, right? There's this weather, this engagement, and you know, you see these extraordinary
some days are
of
blue
things.
skies, some
Right.
days look like this.
And then these sculptures. I mean, this is a whale. It's also another very massive sculpture. I think you can buy it if you want to buy it.
It's for $1 million, you can buy the space whale. What's interesting about the space whale is that it also has the sound. I mean, we're not really showing here all the sounds of Burning Man, but you can hear the sound of whales. And I've often heard it just like a little short clip. To actually sit there and just, a lot of people will just sit and just for like an hour, immerse yourself in the sound of whales for a longer time. It's a really interesting experience.
And at night, the colors start coming in. So this whale was made with a lot of glass, with LEDs, you know, dream, be, and you can see the background of the city. It's a remarkable experience at night. And then here's a moonshot again. And these are conversations that lead to really remarkable developments. This man on the side with his glasses got deeply involved in a project in French Polynesia that was about creating floating islands, and this is still being developed. He's in New Orleans now, basically building on the learnings that he had in French Polynesia, but it came out of this kind of
a lot of the island nations are in danger of losing all their fishing rights and mineral rights because it's tied to land and their land's disappearing.
Given that, of course, we couldn't go to the desert this year, it was done virtually, and it was quite remarkable. The people came by the thousands into this virtual space, and that's part of this kind of extraordinary
So we led a Moonshot tea lounge this last year in August in a virtual space.
So we bring our conversation with you to a close. Yes.